Hello, this is Gavin from more Props.Art.Cosplay, and this is the first of a three-part series showing how I made these Mandalorian Blaster Pistols. I started by cutting out my pattern. You can find a link to the pattern down below. I also got the barrel, trigger, and trigger guard out, so I just had the main shape left in my pattern. Then I traced the pattern out twice on 10mm foam. Using a sharp box cutter, I cut out the two main pieces. When cutting foam, you always want to have a sharp knife, otherwise it will leave rough and unclean cuts in the foam. So after every couple cuts, I sharpen my knife. This is what a cut with a dull knife looks like. It just rips up the foam and doesn't give you a nice, smooth edge. For the trigger, I just grabbed a scrap piece of 6mm foam and the pattern piece that I cut out earlier and traced it and cut it out the same way I did for the rest of the blaster. I glued them together with barge. Barge is a brand of contact cement, which like all contact cements bonds to itself once it's dry. I brushed some on both sides, then waited till it was no longer tacky and just stuck the two parts together. This stuff is very toxic, so make sure you have the proper ventilation and safety gear. Moving air dries barge, so I used a heat gun that had a cold setting on it and just blew over it a couple times. You can also use a hairdryer. There were some edges that had a bit of extra foam on them from when I cut them, so now that they were glued together, I evened out the edges. I cut the notch out with an X-Acto, then separated the pattern parts for overlays. I traced and cut the overlays similarly to the rest of the parts, just in 2mm foam this time. I used the pattern to trace out the placement of the overlay parts. Before I glued on the overlays, there were some rough spots where my knife was a bit too dull, so I grabbed my Dremel and a sanding bit to smooth them out. There were some parts that I didn't trace out earlier with the pattern, so I laid the overlay itself down on the foam and traced it out. I laid a piece of cardboard down on my cutting mat to protect it from glue because I've gotten this stuff on there before and it is really hard to get off. So, trust me, having something between your cutting mat or whatever workspace you're using and the glue is a very good idea. Large parts I'm not as worried about, but when it's doing small stuff like this overlay where I'm brushing the glue past the edges, it is especially essential to have something protecting your workspace from the glue. Like before, I just brushed the glue on both pieces of foam and then used a piece of scrap foam to squeegee off any globs and gloops of the glue, and then just let it dry until it was no longer tacky and stuck the two parts together. I repeated the process for the other side, but I imagine you guys have seen enough of spreading glue on foam and squeegeeing it and letting it dry, so let's just skip to the next part. For the barrel, I'm using an old Sharpie cap. I cut the clip off of it with a pair of flush cutters. I press the cap into the front of the blaster to leave a mark of where I will be dremeling it out for the barrel to go. I lightly sand it with 400 grit sandpaper to remove any bumps as well as give it a bit of texture for paint to adhere to later. I measured out how far I wanted the barrel to stick out just by lining it up with the rest of the blaster. Then I cut off the back portion with the cutting wheel on my Dremel. For drilling out the hole, I used a stone bit on my Dremel around the size of the cap. The hole was a bit smaller than the cap, but the foam has some give to it, so I was able to fit the cap in perfectly. For the trigger guard, I had to make a pattern that would fit and have the right shape. I did this with a cereal box and some paper. I've added this to the pattern for you to download. Once I had the pattern, I cut out the part from an old plastic bin that I had used on other projects. I roughed the surface of this up with sandpaper like I did the cap, and then cut a little groove in the handle for it to sit into, and then a ledge on the main body for it to rest on. I was testing out the fit of the original trigger when I realized the groove was slightly lower than the notch, which caused the guard to have an angle. So I laid the blaster down on a piece of 6mm foam, sketched out a new trigger, and cut it out. I had to do some modifying to it to get it to be the right shape because it was like a 10-second sketch of this. So, whenever you're working on something, double check to make sure everything's straight or however it needs to be before modifying in a way that is a pain in the butt to fix, so you don't have to do what I did. I used super glue on each side and on the ledge to hold the trigger guard in. I put some super glue on the trigger as well and glued that in. Like the trigger and trigger guard, I used super glue to hold the barrel in. I did some dremeling with the sanding bit to smooth out some of the rough areas that I still had, as well as round over all of the edges, which gives it a overall cleaner look if you just round them the smallest bit. It was at this time that I glued on the little overlay piece at the base of the handle. I did some final dremeling and then heat sealed it, which gets rid of all the little fuzzies from dremeling and closes up the pores so that it takes paint better. The final step in fabrication is sealing. For sealing this project, I used a couple thin layers of Plastip. When using Plastip, it is best if you let it sit in a bucket of warm water for about 10 minutes before use. It sprays a finer mist when you do this, resulting in a smoother surface. This concludes the first part. Part 2 will be how I constructed this 3D printed one, and will be coming out in the near future, so keep an eye out if you would like to see how I complete these. Hope everyone enjoyed, and see you next time.